which I've now done. So let's make a start. So, well, firstly, welcome everyone to our call. As I say, there's a couple of people on the call for the first time this week, so particular welcome to you. Thank you for joining. Hope this is useful. If I briefly share my screen, and there'll be a slight delay on doing it this week, mainly because I've not got my normal setup. So it's not wanting to play. Let me try that again. Right, that's better. Okay, so just to briefly share my screen. Quick reminder. In a second, I'll hand over to Michael, who's kindly volunteered to talk about the impact of NIS2 on the domain name industry. So I won't steal this thunder by talking anything about that, but I think this is a really important topic, given that this is something which kicks in about 5 months' time, give or take a few days, so is imminent in the overall scheme of things. So Mike will talk about that, and then depending on how much time we have at the end, time permitting, I'll talk about a few recent developments from the weekly headlines that I shared earlier today, then some forthcoming events, future core topics, and if there's time permitting, we'll pause for any other business before finishing off at the bottom of the hour. So I'll stop sharing. If you want to ask questions of Michael, you can pop questions in the chat, and we'll refer to that. Otherwise, you can raise your virtual hand. At the bottom of your screen, you should have an icon that says it's called reactions. If you click on that, as I've just done, there's a button that comes up where you can raise your virtual hand, which I've just done. And if you change your mind, you can lower it, which I've also just done. So either use that, so it's the reactions icon, or alternately, particularly if you're somewhere where perhaps you can't easily talk, if it's a noisy environment, just pop a question in the chat, preferably prefix it with chat, so with question even, so I know it's a question and I'll read it out loud for the benefit of the recording, and then we can pick that up. But anyway, without further ado, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. And can everyone see my screen, correct?
I certainly can, Michael.
Excellent. So again, Andrew, thank you for inviting me today to speak on a topic that I think is important. And by way of background, I've been involved in the domain name industry now in both a legal and a technical capacity for about 30 years. And I consider this, in my opinion, to be one of the more impactful pieces of legislation that will likely have a long-lasting effect on the industry. So what is NIS2? NIS2 stands for the Network and Information Security Act. And one of the things to understand about this particular piece of European legislation is that it is a directive and not a regulation. In Europe, there are basically two types of legislative initiatives: directives and regulations. Regulations such as the GDPR, which most people are familiar with. When a regulation is passed, that is generally imposed uniformly across all EU member states. A directive, however, needs to go through a process called transposition, and that is where individual member states need to transpose the directive into national law. And this provides the ability for member states to perhaps enhance or clarify, as long as it's not inconsistent with the overall NIS2 directive. So that is important. And as Andrew alluded to a couple of minutes ago, transposition is supposed to be complete in October of this year. I believe there have been about 4 member states that have already proposed final language that has been implemented into national law. There are a number of others that are still moving through the pipeline in various stages. So the subject of NIS2, basically the objective was to achieve a high common level of cybersecurity across the entire EU. Now, what is important here is that this directive applies to both public as well as private entities that are specifically enumerated in either Annex 1 or Annex 2 of the directive. Annex 1 deals with sectors of high criticality, and Annex 2 deals with other critical sectors. As you can understand, the reason I am speaking today is that DNS service providers, excluding operators of root servers, as well as TLD name registries, actually are specifically enumerated in paragraph 8 of Annex 1 under the subtitle of digital infrastructure. Now, one of the things that I would encourage everyone to do if you're going to brave reading through the NIS2 directive is to start in Article 6 with the definitions. And I think back to my one law professor, criminal law, who always says, start by reading the damn statute. I have always use that same analogy to read the definitions, because this is probably one of the most important parts of any legislative initiative. And what you can see in Article 6, paragraph 20, is how the directive defines a DNS service provider. And that is any publicly available recursive domain name resolution services for end users, or an authoritative domain name resolution services for third-party use, with the exception of root name servers. Now, one of the other things that I think is important in the definition section is under 21, where they define top-level domain name registry. Now, one of the things that is very important to note here is this does not make the distinction between GTLDs or CCTLDs. They specifically state that it is available to all TLDs. Also important is the expansive definition under paragraph 22's entitled Entities Providing Domain Name Registration Services. So this just goes beyond registries and registrars, but those providing privacy or proxy services for purposes of Article 28. So what I am now going to do is I am now going to go through a number of the relevant articles in the NIS2 directive, and I'm going to kind of skip around. I'm going to begin with Article 28 because this is the one that has currently received the most attention, at least within the ICANN and as well as the center community. And paragraph 1 states that all TLD name registries and entities providing domain name registration services shall collect and maintain accurate and complete domain name registration data in a dedicated database. Now, paragraph 2 actually sets forth the specific elements that need to be collected. Obviously, domain name and registration date are kind of obvious, but also they set forth the registrant's name, the contact email, as well as the telephone number. There is an additional requirement that if there is a difference between the administrative contact and the registrant, that the entity is required to collect the contact email address and the telephone number of that administrative contact. Now, there are some additional requirements to Article 28. And one of the requirements is that the TLD name registries and entities providing domain name registration services shall publicly make available the policies and procedures, including verification procedures. And I'm going to come back to this in a couple of slides on why the public availability of these policies and procedures are very important. Before that, I want to turn to paragraph 5. And this is a requirement that the entities, the registries, and those providing domain name registration services shall provide access to specific domain name registration data upon lawful and duly substantiated request by legitimate access seekers within a 72-hour period. And in the next slide, I'll provide a little clarity on what qualifies as a legitimate access seeker. Finally, and this is, I think, one of the more important parts that bears closely following, and this has to do in paragraph 6, that there is an obligation that talks about that compliance with paragraph 1 through 5 shall not result in a duplication of collecting domain name registration data. And to that end, registries and entities providing domain name registration services shall cooperate with each other. One of the things that is interesting when you look at the GTLD space versus the CCTLD space in Europe is the following distinction. In the G space, I would say that there is a growing trend where registries want to be thin and have a minimum data set, and have most of that data be collected and maintained at the registrar, closest to the registrant. This, however, is I would say, in conflict with a number of European CCTLDs that view them as having a centralized database of that authoritative data. So how this plays out in the implementation and best practices is something that I think bears close watching, because there does not seem to be an alignment. And as I noted previously, the directive does not make a distinction between Gs and Cs. So one of the other things that's important when you're reading a piece of legislation is, before the articles in the NIS2 directive, there are recitals or preambles, and these basically appear before, as I said, the articles of the actual directive. And one of the things that is important is, in the US, I kind of equate this to the legislative history. This is the context about how the directive was brought about, different points that was considered. And these recitals potentially have a number of benefits. One, for individual member states that need to transpose the directive into national law, this gives them the ability to see where they may want to deviate or enhance certain aspects. And also, generally in legal proceedings, it provides courts the ability to understand, again, what was the legislative history involving this particular directive. There are two recitals that I want to call everyone's attention to that I think are important. First is the recital 110, and this goes to defining what is a legitimate access seeker. And as you can see by this definition, it is rather narrow when it talks about competent authorities under union or national law for the prevention, investigation, detection, or prosecution of criminal offenses, certs, and CSerts. This was a point of contention with some of my intellectual property colleagues that were looking to have, if you will, intellectual property owners specifically enumerated. That did not happen. So that, again, is an area of how legitimate access seekers will be defined, or how that may be expanded going forward, something to follow closely. The other recital, which I thought was rather interesting and worth noting, is recital 111. And this is where they were talking about policies and procedures to collect and maintain accurate and complete data. There is a provision, which I have highlighted below, that talks about those policies and procedures should take into account, to the extent possible, the standards developed by multi-stakeholder governance structures at international level. This has widely been acknowledged as code speak for ICANN. And what I think is interesting, and I actually think the European Union, I think the EU threaded the needle on this. I think they do want to give deference to the ICANN multi-stakeholder model and what they are trying to do at the global level. But what they've done is, by qualifying it to the extent possible, is, in my opinion, ICANN has become, as it has grown, it has become a lot less efficient in timely implementing policies. Looking back to the early days, things used to get done in months and years. Sadly, now we're talking years and decades. Just look at the new GTLD process, which has taken over 10 years, as well as the privacy proxy. So I think what happens here is there is a deference to ICANN, but if there is inaction, this provides the European Union as well as individual member states to move forward to advance their cybersecurity initiatives. So let's see. So there are a couple of, let's see, these are some other recitals. Again, in the interest of time, I don't want to spend too much time on it. I do just want to mention another provision in recital 111 that talks about the best practices used within the industry, and to the extent possible, progress made in the field of electronic identification. One of the things that I think is very interesting here is the work that the European Union is doing right now with EIDAS 2, as well as the European Digital Wallet Initiative. One of the CCTLD registries, CZNIC, is part of one of the large-scale pilots, and they have actually put forward a number of use cases in the EIDAS large-scale pilots that would use the European wallet architectural reference framework as part of the registration and maintenance of domain names. So I think that is important. And finally, with regard to recital 112, there is a clear distinction there regarding the requirement that registrations associated with legal persons be made publicly available. In the ICANN policy world, following GDPR, ICANN kind of passed on that, making that hard distinction. But it does appear that with regard to NIS2, they are forcing the hand for registries to make that distinction. And based upon a survey I did a year or two ago, currently over, I think, 80% of European CCTLDs already make that distinction between natural and legal registrants. Article 21 is perhaps my favorite aspect of the NIS2 directive, and this is basically provides a broad overview of what tasks and affirmative actions entities must take to address cybersecurity risk management procedures. And the particular paragraph that I think is most problematic is paragraph 2D, that talks about supply chain security, including security-related aspects concerning the relationship between each entity and its direct suppliers or service providers. And as I was discussing with Andrew earlier today, when you look at a lot of the cybersecurity instances that have been happening, particularly in the software sector, and how that supply chain potentially is impactful, this is something that I think is potentially even more problematic than Article 28, and specifically why. My law professor always says, read the damn statute. One of the other provisions is, what are the fines? And what's interesting here is Article 34 talks about the general conditions for imposing administrative fines. And as you'll note here, it states that member states shall ensure, when there is infringement of Article 21 or 23 of essential entities. Notice there is no specific mention of Article 28, but instead Article 21. And the fines that you're looking at here are at least 10 million euros or a maximum of at least 2% of global worldwide annual turnover, whichever is higher. So this is rather GDPR-like in its fines. So now one of the questions that I think people are asking is, okay, this is very interesting, Mike, but who does this apply to? And I'm going to answer that specific question over the next couple of slides. So Article 28 calls for ENISA to create and maintain a registry of DNS service providers, TLD name registries, and entities providing domain name registration services, as well as a whole bunch of other people, that will basically have a directory of contact information for these entities. Now, much like there was a lot of concern regarding the extraterritorial impact of GDPR for non-European companies located outside the EU, but providing providing services in the European Union, Article 28 basically has that same extraterritorial reach to the NIS2 provision. So under paragraph 2, there is a requirement on where these providers need to register, what member states they need to register. There is right now, paragraph 2 talks about the decision being where the cybersecurity risk management measures are predominantly taken. Now, paragraph 2 goes on to say, if it is not clear how to make that determination, you need to go to the establishment with the highest number of employees in the union. So that is the default. So if you are a company operating in Europe, paragraph 2 will provide you guidance on what jurisdiction you potentially would want to register and be subject to. Paragraph 3 talks about the DNS service providers and TLD registries not offering. There, they need to designate a representative in the union. Failure to designate a specific representative in the union at a member state, failure to do that then subjects you to any member state where you are providing services and there is a violation. So again, for companies that are operating outside the EU, you really need to look at how individual member states are transposing NIS2 and then make that determination where you potentially want to register. So Article 14. So as you can understand, there is a lot. This is a very beefy directive with a lot of moving parts. And one of the things that was done was Article 14 specifically created the concept of a cooperation group. And the cooperation group was designed to help individual member states in the transposition of this directive into member state law, and perhaps point 2, which is most importantly, exchanging best practices and information in relation to implementing this directive. As I mentioned in some of the recitals, they talk about best practices. So Article 14 is really designed to be this clearinghouse where, if you will, provide thought leadership on what are these best practices. And within the cooperation group, there are 2 work streams that I would like to direct everyone's attention to. The first is a work stream for digital infrastructure and providers, and then a second work stream on WHOIS. With regard to the work stream on WHOIS, there are 2 subtask force. One, a task force on verification, and then a task force on legitimate access. It's interesting to note that the chair of the workforce on digital infrastructure and who is Finn Peterson. He is from Denmark. He actually is a GAC representative participating in ICANN, and he is the actual chair of this. So this is something that if you do have an interest on the impact of NIS2, I would encourage you to follow the work that Finn is doing in these two particular work streams. And with that, I will stop sharing and go back so I can read the chat and other things. So let's see, I'm going to read the questions and I could open it up to anyone that has any questions.
Thanks, Michael. A reminder that if you see the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen, use that, click on that, and then raise your virtual hand. If you want to join the queue that way, it will pop something in the chat if that's easier. Just while people are thinking, and that was a really good presentation, Michael, by the way. Well, in the chat, you'll see the comment from Simon about we shouldn't make assumptions of what particular phrases mean. And as you pointed out, the legislation actually spells out what they mean in the context of NIS2, and that's what counts when it comes to applying this. And then you'll see I put a couple of comments. One, that to the extent possible, I think that phrasing that you highlighted is pretty important, because I read that as, if follow what ICANN or others say in the multi-stakeholder community if you can, but when push comes to shove, compliance with this is what counts. You can't use something that, let's pick on ICANN for no good reason. You can't use what ICANN has said as an excuse to be non-compliant with NIS2. That wouldn't be a get out of jail card, I don't believe, because of that phrasing.
I would agree with that, and I think what is very interesting is and for the interest for anyone that is interested in this topic, just a couple of additional reference points that you may find of interest. ECO, as part of the Day Zero event at the Hamburg meeting last year, the ICANN annual meeting. ECO hosted a Day Zero event, and there were representatives from the commission as well as Finn Peterson who spoke on this. So that is a good recording. I would encourage everyone to read that. I also hosted a session at the ICANN 79 meeting in Puerto Rico. It was the ALAC plenary on trust and registrant verification. And what was interesting on that was I had, I believe there were 7 registries, both GTLDs as well as CCTLDs, that talked about their current registrant verification procedures and what they are doing. And finally, just a call out to the upcoming ICANN registration operation workshop. There actually is going to be, I think this is in early June, and Andrew, I think you had referenced the call to paper for this in some of your announcements previous. But in this upcoming ROW 13 event, there will be a technical panel discussing a number of European CCTLDs. I believe it's Estonia, DNIC, and DNIC and .at that will be talking about particular technical implementations that they are doing, including some changes to the EPP protocol to incorporate some of these additional flags that are required. So for anyone that is interested in this topic or who have found this, I would direct them to those 3 resources for additional more technical aspects as opposed to this more legalese one. But I think both of them actually complement one another.
Yeah. So does anyone have any questions or comments? If you do, as I say, raise your virtual hand or pop something in the chat, whichever's easier for you. And perhaps while you're thinking, I should also say, And I'll happily share some stuff post-call if people are interested. Although we've obviously focused on the sort of DNS area for this call, NIS2 has a much wider sort of catchment, if you will, of a very broad range of industries. I think closest to home, network operators, be that ISPs or telcos, are definitely covered. But then you've got, you know, companies sort of space engineering or electricity supply or wastewater disposal. So it is very broad. Loosely speaking, possibly critical national infrastructure sort of ish is sort of what's covered, and a few others like the finance sector. So it is a pretty broad reach. And the requirements, such as having to do a supply chain audit, as I put in the chat, I know for enterprises more generally that are caught up in this, it's certainly focusing minds that they're having to go talk to their suppliers to ask them about what they're supplying in a lot more detail. And if they haven't done that and there's an issue, then the enterprise will be liable. If they've done that, there's a subsequent issue, then arguably the liability will go down the chain somewhat. So there's a lot to be done in a short space of time.
So I don't see any questions. If anyone does have any, send them to either Andrew or I. And if not, I will give you back the remainder of the time for the latest upgrade on news, which I always look forward to. So I don't want to cut that off today.
Okay. Well, and are you happy if I share the slides post call as well, Michael? Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again for that. That was really interesting. Right. So let's harness that time then. So I'll just reshare my screen. So I hope that was useful. As I say, it was certainly interesting to me, so rather selfish, but there you are. Right, so as always, I'm not going to go through all these. It take far too long. And those of you that signed up to the weekly headlines will have these in your inboxes, so you can read them at your leisure. But the ones I'll draw to your attention. So this is my random selection from within them. Top of the screen on the first slide here, CISA reveals guidance for implementation of encrypted DNS protocols. So basically, the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, has put out guidance essentially requiring the use of encrypted DNS by federal civilian agencies, but they've been quite prescriptive as to how to implement the support for it. So that's, those of you that is interested in encrypted DNS, that's definitely worth a look. And then slightly further down the screen, you'll see third one down, hackers use DNS tunneling for network scanning and tracking victims. So this is some research published in the last few days by Palo Alto Networks, just showing additional uses of DNS tunneling in some malicious campaigns that they've been delving into. So additional uses of the DNS, but not in a good way, clearly, in a sense. I'll have to ask our good friend Peter Lowe to maybe add that to his list of creative uses of the DNS as well. Okay, I will, as I say, you'll see all of these in the news headlines email. If you don't get that, by the way, ping me an email and I'll happily add you to the distribution list. And all of these links will also be with a link to the recording. Okay, on this side, third one down, the DNS Research Federation's Internet Standards Observatory held a round table last Thursday, I think it was, looking at some of the early work of a number of research teams that they've commissioned. And there's a short write-up and perhaps more usefully a link to the recording of the round table, which is about 90 minutes. So it covers a number of interesting issues around, so you'll hear standards washing mentioned, amongst other things, which I'll claim the credit for coining that phrase. Probably I'm not the only one that's coined it, but anyway, that's one of the things that comes up in that discussion. So if you're interested more on the research side, that's worth a look. And also, since we've been talking about who is, ICANN put out a note last week with the first findings from their registration data request service pilot, RDRS. So that began running roughly 6 months ago. It's due to run as a pilot for 2 years. So it's roughly a quarter of the way in. And I believe this is the first time they've published some results of that. So given that's intended to make the data that's captured more accurate, then given the context of NIS2, that's especially topical, I think, this week. And then finally, from the headlines, of which there were quite a few this week, so it was a bumper issue, bottom of the screen, well, bottom but one, again from CISA in the US. They published a list of companies that have signed up to their Secure by Design pledge, which is a voluntary pledge. It's voluntary, but I think they're increasingly expecting, if you want to supply federal agencies, then you have to show you've got secure design practices. So this is one mechanism to do that. And I suspect they'll be ratcheting up the requirements year on year. And then finally, I will shamelessly plug Josh Keogh's post on LinkedIn from a few days back, which in turn mentions our DELEG panel discussion of last week. So if you haven't yet looked at the recording, if you weren't on the call last week, then click on that to access the recording of the discussion with Paul Fixie, Paul Petrus, Ralph Weber, and others from this time last week. And then other stuff, more tangentially of interest. Again, I won't go through all these, take far too long, but I'll just highlight the one you can see. So about 2/3 of the way down. So this is more eclectic list of topics, but amongst other things, Europe has highlighted car chips as one of the next battlegrounds with China. I think of the theme of the RSA conference a couple of weeks ago that I was at, and also I believe the cybersecurity conference in London last week was China and the sort of cybersecurity threat posed. So I hadn't seen reference to car chips previously, so that was interesting to see that one called out on Politico in the last few days. Okay, moving on. In terms of sort of deadlines that are looming, the first one, 24th, so end of this week. If you want to have a birds of a feather session at the ITF meeting in Vancouver in late July, the deadline for your initial submission is this Friday. So do bear that in mind. It's coming up quite quickly. I think you do need to go on the support of an area director as well, but I suspect you can put the proposal in, then sort that out. But don't miss the deadline for the proposal. And also this Friday, if you had aspirations to apply for the ICANN grant program, then you've got again till this Friday to put your applications in. And that link, second bullet down, includes guidance on what to put in your application. And then, as you'll see, scrolling down the list, there's other deadlines coming up over the next couple of months or so. By the way, if you're aware of any other calls for presentations, etc., or papers and so on, feel free to ping me an email. I'll happily add those to the list. Okay, where are we? So forthcoming events, there's lots of interesting stuff coming up. So I'm at a hotel because I'm in London for the Peer Conference, which starts back end of today and runs mainly tomorrow and Wednesday. Also this week we got the RIPE conference in Poland all week. So I know a number of people that normally be on this call will be in Poland for that. So hopefully you've caught up with the recording by the time you see this. And then I'll mention also in a couple of weeks' time, I think Tom was on this call actually, but Tommy Johnson's kindly agreed to come on to talk about the Zero Trust DNS. And time permitting, we'll also do a brief preview of the Eurodig event, which is in third week of June, if I remember rightly. And there's, again, a whole bunch of stuff running through to the end of the year, which you'll see. in the email. Specifically when it comes to RIPE, the RIPE 88 meeting, the DNS working group session is on Wednesday of this week. As you can see, local time it's 9 till 10:30. That's UTC plus 2 hours. It's got a number of sessions, so DNSSEC bootstrapping, Deleg inevitably. Good to see that Dave Lawrence is covering that, and other things. So there's a good solid program. Quite a lot of it squeezed into an hour and a half, in fact. So and there's plenty of other interesting things at the RIPE conference as well, but I thought it's worth just highlighting that. Yeah, and you can join remotely. So if you're not registered to go to RIPE, but have a diary space, then that's worth registering just to dial in for that hour and a half, even if you can't make the whole of the program. Okay, in terms of other things, I've kind of touched on our next call. So we don't have a call next Monday, this time next week, because there's a public holiday in a variety of countries. So it seemed to clash with too many things in too many places. So we'll skip that. So the next call proper will be 2 weeks for Zero Trust DNS, which I'm looking forward to. In terms of dates, we don't yet have scheduled calls for. I've only one which Paul Mocker-Petris pinged me an email for after the call last week, which was about certificates, because that came up during the discussion on Deleg. So he suggested it would be useful to do, and this is only a working title, certificates for DNS dummies, or maybe so to really get into that topic from the context of what's relevant to the DNS. So if anyone on this call has knowledge of that, or knows of someone that could talk to that, or indeed about ICANN and DNS and content blocking, or DNS abuse, then feel free to reach out to me and to either volunteer yourself or volunteer someone else, and I'll add those to the schedule for the coming weeks. And if you've got other topics, as Paul Mocker-Petris did, again, feel free to just let me know, and I'll happily add those as well. Okay, I've deliberately rattled through that quite quickly, given that certainly the headlines people have had in any case. So let me stop sharing and pause there and see if anyone has got any questions on any of that, or indeed wants to raise anything else, because we've definitely got time for any other business, should you have anything else you want to draw to people's attention. If you do, sort of raise your virtual hand, put something in the chat if that's easier, or if all else fails, just unmute and start talking if you don't normally use Zoom and are struggling with the interface. I'll give a few seconds to see if anyone does want to come on with anything. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone typing at the moment. I can't see anyone with their hand raised or indeed that's unmuted. So last call for any other business. Right, it doesn't look like it. Well, in which case, let's sort of stop there. So you get 10 minutes or so back to do other interesting things. So thank you all for coming on the call. Thank you in particular, Michael, for sort of sharing the salient points about NIS2. And I hope people will now have that on their radar and will look into the topic in more detail in your own time. Michael definitely wasn't providing legal advice. Probably ought to put that health warning on, but do consult your advisors if you believe it applies to you, because it, as Michael highlighted, the potential financial implications are significant. $10 million or 2% of your global annual turnover would focus most people's minds, I suspect. So I'll show a link to the recording possibly tonight, maybe tomorrow. See how I get on with the conference. So you'll have that and Michael's slides for good measure, just to refer back to. So thank you, Michael, again. Have a fantastic week, everyone. Remember, we don't have a call next week. So enjoy next Monday as well, whatever you're doing. Hope it's a public holiday wherever you are. And catch up in 2 weeks' time when we can learn more about Zero Trust DNS. So see you all there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good holiday.